There's Madame Sony, goldsmith, and he's going to build a brand new house. Well, he builds a brand new house that looks like an old house. The obvious point that I'm making is that he's not looking at Western magazines. This is a rich man in India. We all hear about India all the time, but the parody of India in the Western media is always that the Indians are sort of co-opting Western ideas. Don't be fooled. Indians have looked cooperative since the Mughals have been in India. And Indians have been dead centered on their own culture for that whole time. And once they rule us through their technological savvy, we will all slowly become Indians. I'm only half joking. But what I'm talking about is that Madame Sony is a wealthy man, a young man. He wants to build a house. He's a rich man. He wants to live in the city. And what does he do? He still has craftsmen who can make what he wants. And he wants a house that might look like it's 17th century or 15th century, that looks like it belongs in Jaisalmer, and that's what he cares about. In case you're wondering exactly what you're looking at a sheet of sandstone that's been carved into patterns that will allow the wind to pass through, but people won't be able to see inside. That is to say, Madame Sony is unbelievable. This is a brand new house that's still not been finished. So you're looking at a house literally in progress. And it depends on these guys. There's beautiful sandstone to carve. They're tremendously talented carvers to carve it. And so that you don't have to copy somebody else's style. Instead, you've got your own style and you carry it forward. I use Jaisalmer, Rajasthan, Madame Sony, Jetmal Singh Bhakti, simply to make the point that the world is really big and there are lots and lots of different traditions in it. There is no world history. There are hundreds of simultaneous histories. And we could be very confused about the general spread in these days in which everybody is talking about globalization and reviving their local traditions like crazy. We'd be very confused about the possibility of a one world. Instead, architecture teaches that there's all this diversity, and there's at least, you're now looking at a house from Japan, at least an Asian alternative. There's certainly a Western evolutionary move that seems to move from natural to artificial and from open to closed. But that's not, by any means, a universal pattern. It's one of the patterns, a peculiar pattern that's ended up here in upstate New York. But it's certainly not the pattern of Japan, and it's not the pattern of India, and it's not the pattern of China. And I don't want to be alarmist about all this, but you will remember that in India there are more peasants than there are people in the United States and Europe put together. I mean, we're a minority, a fairly small minority. And I, at the beginning of this talk, talked about the history of our minority on the face of the earth. Well, let me tell you, there's China and India. And their patterns are just not ours. The architecture that's being built there is just not ours, despite the little decorative moments in Beijing. Well, I'm telling you an obvious thing. I come home. Back to America, I say, fortunately, there are a lot of vernacular buildings left. They can still be studied. And not only do those buildings talk about regional difference and ethnic difference, they even include magnificent buildings that survived from the people before any Europeans or Africans came to these shores. Look at the little exhibition that's just next door to this auditorium of Curtis's photographs, and look at those Northwest Coast houses. Unbelievable. Look at this Taos Pueblo. They're beautiful buildings. They really represent something different. So that in America, there's still enough evidence for us to be able to make some understandings about vernacular architecture. And in America, I'll tell you, the vernacular spirit is wounded but not dead. But America has become, as Ireland has become, really a landscape of ruins. A landscape of ruins and a landscape of commodified housing. Commodified housing that tragically speaks about the increasing difference between the poor and the rich. In the big world, we share with everybody in the world the terror of destruction. If places are as meaningful as I argue and believe them to be, I greet every torn down house with the same smile that I would greet the burning of a library. It's a vicious attack on our heritage. Every house, every cheesy filling station, every unattractive past house is filled with history. To destroy any one of them is a violent attack. I want us all to resist as much as possible that destruction. And all of us, in the midst of resisting destruction, live in something, and in that something, God bless us, we do the best we can, shaping around us an environment that's attractive, where we can welcome guests and recipe times. That's the center of vernacular. Thanks very much. I have fun. I'm worried, but I haven't lost hope. One of my greatest friends, I feel this is the thing to say at this moment, James Marston Fitch. Some of you might have known Jimmy Fitch. He was the curator of Central Park for a while. He founded the Historic Preservation Program in Columbia. He was a dedicated communist and elegant man. And he said, things have changed, but they'll change again. Hold on.
Does anyone have questions?
Yeah.
I have a practical question. I saw it in about thatch.
Yes.
One of your photographs, the chimney was only 3 brick courses above the thatch. Very short chimney.
Yeah.
And there's the thatch. Does it ever catch fire?
Very rarely, although it does constantly in architectural history books. The great problem is rot more than fire. And so the thatch will tend, in most places in the world that has thatching, will tend to get wet rather than burn. Doesn't mean that it isn't dangerous. It does mean that there are a lot of features, like you may recall, if you could picture in your mind, the standard, very early Tyrone, Virginia chimney is set away from the house at the top. And that's generally because it was keeping that radiant heat away from the thatch, which is much more dangerous than the proposition of actual sparks and so on. If sparks come out of the chimney, I mean, I've thatch houses in Ireland I've lived in for decades. They don't, I don't know how to turn this thing away. The thatching is naturally there. So fire is a problem, but it's not the biggest problem. Thatching is a lot less flammable than shingles, for example, which were much more normal. It's a concern, but it's not the deepest concern in thatching. Rot is much worse. Yes?
You talked about the houses. What about the agricultural landscape? I mean, one of your early books, I should mention, is the one on Otsego Barns, but that landscape is also being wiped away.
It's tragic. I couldn't agree more. It's really sad. I've worked in historic preservation in Indiana. We have a local historic preservation operation, Bloomington Restorations Incorporated, and I've been the president of it a few times. The disaster in our neighborhood are two from the standpoint of preservation for history. One is that farm buildings are relic. Nobody wants them, nobody wants to keep them up, and so barns are going fast. The other one is houses have to be big enough to meet modern needs, which means small houses are endangered. And so that I have plenty enough historical perspective on historic preservation to tell you that those are the two big problems. The very area of Virginia about which some of you read, I chose that area because there were a few very small houses. And I was back there summer before last and did a resurvey that whole area. And there's some very interesting patterns, the main ones being that every house under 2 rooms is gone. Every house built by an African American is gone. Every house that had 6 or more rooms, even if it was in terrible shape in 1966, had been restored. Every barn is gone. Those are the patterns. The sad thing then is that the built landscape, which I would like to use as a fallback resource for writing more democratic history, is becoming the same kind of elitist thing that the documentary record is. That is to say, big houses are surviving, small ones are not. Outbuildings, industrial buildings, working buildings are all going very, very rapidly. It's tragic, I think. It's just awful. And without the kind of tax laws that are available, for example, in England, to support barns, if you have a barn that's genuinely historical in England, you can get a tax break by just keeping that thing up. Because it's an amenity on the landscape. Now, an aesthetic amenity instead of an economic one, but that's what's happening. Small buildings are going. So that area of Virginia, I was amazed of about 2/3 of the houses that I surveyed in 1966 are still standing. But as I say, they're all associated with white families and they're all big. I did the same kind of survey in the most northwesterly county of Alabama, Franklin County, an amazingly rich county. That was a piece of Tennessee Valley. And I went back with a friend from the University of Alabama at Birmingham 3 years ago, and out of 280 houses, 2 were left. See, that's an area where old houses meant poverty to the people they wanted to get rid of. Old houses don't mean poverty in Virginia. They mean heritage. It's an attitude. Those Alabama houses, it's just all mobile homes, and actually it's mostly just depopulated. Population has fallen by 60%. And all those houses, it's not just that they've fallen in, they've been razed. They've been torn down. I have too many words, I apologize. But it's moving that there was one of the most important houses that I found in the Virginia book that I wrote. It was a very small house built by a man called Sam Dabney. It was 18 feet square, built in 1764. And just there are not very many houses of that size left from that early period. And the farmer who owned it had just let it stand for a long time, and that's when I measured it, it was still standing. But one day he just got tired of the thing. And he took a tractor over there, he threw a lock chain around the house and just started driving as rapidly as he could, tore the house down, and set it on fire. A friend of mine, an African-American carpenter who lived across the street from it, courageously went into the fire with his tractor and pulled out the sill log because he thought that building was so important. That's a kind of tiny example of the war over the landscape. The old-time inhabitant, with a lot of historical sense, Mr. Buckley, wanted to save at least some piece of that house. It was a white guy's house, but it was history, it was his history. The young farmer that inherited his grandfather's farm didn't give a damn about it, just tore it. Didn't have to be torn down, it could have been left as a colorful flower ruin. People, those things mean poverty. That's why in Ireland, the community I studied had 53 houses, 1 remains. They meant poverty to the next generation. They didn't just, not want to live in them. They hated them. So it's economics, it's an attitude. There's too many things in farm buildings, who cares? I do. Everybody should. I wish everybody would just go out and measure 5 barns. Put it in a record, but we don't have to save them all. Put it somewhere so people in the future can know, because barns are the most beautiful buildings built in the American landscape were, in fact, the greatest. Barns in Pennsylvania are probably the handsomest buildings that anybody ever created on us. At least the eastern side of America. I think we get out to the west, there's some churches that I think beat the barns. But it's close.